January 2018, London. The lights are on in the corridors of the Treasury and the Cabinet Office at an hour when most buildings are dark. A phone call is transferred between departments. An internal briefing is being turned over and over, read. Annotations circling the words "going concern." In a hospital somewhere in the Midlands, a rota is being redrawn. At a construction site in Scotland, access cards are still being swiped. The fluorescent lights hum. The printer ejects warm sheets of paper. Rain strikes the windows and shoe saws leave wet marks on the floor. When the invisible organ of a nation stops receiving blood, who knows first? But to understand how this moment arrived, you need to go back. Back to when the organ was still being assembled. Back to the late 1990s, when a particular idea was circulating. Through Whitehall, an idea that would reshape how Britain delivered its schools, hospitals, roads, and prisons. The idea was simple. The state didn't need to build things itself anymore. It could hire someone else to do it. Outsourcing. A partnership. Efficiency. The documents from that era are careful and optimistic. White papers discuss value for money. Consultants produce charts showing cost savings. The language is the language of modernization. And into this moment steps a company that doesn't yet have the name you'll come to know, but will soon take it. In 1999, two construction firms merge, Tarmac and Wimpy. The combined entity is larger, more capable, more national in scope. They need a new name. They choose Carillion. It sounds solid. Ramah. Built to last. The new company's leadership understands the opportunity in front of them. The government wants partners who can do everything. Not just build a hospital, but run its facilities. Not just construct a road, but maintain it for decades. Carillion can do this. Or at least Carillion can say it can do this. In the boardroom, the chief executive emphasizes scale, coverage, presence, the ability to be everywhere at once. It's persuasive, the first major. Public contracts are signed. The amounts are large. The durations are long. 20 years, 30 years. These are not simple construction jobs. They are agreements to provide services into a future that nobody can see. But the contracts are written and the documents are filed and the work begins on a construction site. In the early morning, the shifts change over. Workers clock in. The site manager checks the schedule against the weather. Concrete needs to cure. Deadlines need to be met. This is the visible part. The part you can touch. But there's another part, equally important. Taking shape in offices far from the mud and scaffolding. On a whiteboard in a conference room, someone has taped up a cash flow projection. Revenue is expected. Costs are estimated. The gap between them is called profit, but profit on a 30-year contract is a strange thing to calculate. You can't know what it will be. You can only forecast it. And forecasts, unlike concrete, can be adjusted as the company grows. More mergers, more acquisitions. Each one adds capacity, adds contracts, adds to the sense that Carillion is becoming indispensable. The debt grows too, but debt in this context is considered normal, expected. You borrow to grow. Growth justifies the borrowing. It's a cycle that works as long as the contracts keep coming, and the contracts do keep coming. Government officials speak warmly of partnership, of shared goals, of the private sector's ability to deliver what the public sector cannot. Carillion is mentioned in budget announcements, in procurement frameworks, in the infrastructure plans that promise better schools and better hospitals and better roads. The company is no longer just a contractor. It is part of the system, but inside the finance department, there are conversations happening that don't make it into the press releases. Conversations about accounting policy, about how to recognize revenue on contracts that span decades. The rules allow for something called percentage of completion. You estimate the total profit a contract will generate over its lifetime. Then, you recognize a portion of that profit each year based on how much work you've done. It's logical, but it requires judgment. And judgment is where things start to get interesting when an auditor arrives. The audit is not adversarial. It's a process. There are checklists. There are questions. The auditors ask about assumptions, about risk assessments, about whether the estimated costs on these long-term contracts are reasonable. The company provides answers. Documents are reviewed. Meetings are held. Eventually, an opinion is issued. The financial statements give a true and fair view. The process has been followed. Inside the company, emails circulate about how to phrase certain risks in the annual report. The language needs to be accurate, but not alarming, comprehensive, but not excessive. Legal reviews the wording. Communications reviews the tone. What emerges is a document that says many things and commits to very little. Meanwhile, a new bonus scheme is announced. Executive compensation is tied to growth targets, to earnings per share, to contract wins. The incentives are clear. Get bigger, show profit, win more work, and for a while, it works. The numbers go up. The share price goes up. The annual reports show a company in control. But if you were to stand on one of Carillion's construction sites in those early years and look around, you would see something simple. People building things, pouring foundations, raising walls. It's tangible, real. You can measure it in meters and tons. But back in the office, a different kind of construction is happening. A structure made of estimates and projections and carefully worded assurances. And unlike the buildings going up on site, this structure has no foundation you can inspect. It exists in documents, in spreadsheets. In the gap between what is happening and what is being reported, the contracts pile up. Schools, hospitals, military housing, road maintenance, facilities management. By the mid-2000s, Carillion is involved in so many aspects of public infrastructure that disentangling it would be unthinkable. The company has made itself necessary, not through conspiracy, but through ordinary business. By bidding on contracts, by winning them, by being there. And the government, having chosen this model of outsourcing, needs companies like Carillion to make it work. It's a mutual dependence that nobody talks about, but everyone understands. In a treasury meeting, someone asks what happens if one of these major contractors fails. The question is theoretical, a risk to be noted. There are contingency plans, surely, procedures, but the question doesn't get a detailed answer because the premise seems unlikely. These are large, established companies. They have auditors. They have oversight. They have relationships with government that go back years. The system is designed to prevent failure, and so the engine keeps running. Contracts are signed. Work is done. Invoices are sent. Payments are made. Cash comes in and cash goes out, and the difference is supposed to be profit. But on a contract that lasts 30 years, the profit is always partially hypothetical. It depends on the future, on costs that haven't been incurred yet, on efficiencies that haven't been achieved yet, on risks that haven't materialized yet. The present is certain. The future is a forecast, and forecasts can be revised. Back on the construction site, a supervisor marks off another milestone. The schedule is tight but achievable. The budget is tight but manageable. Everyone knows that projects run over. That's normal. The question is how much, and whether the overrun can be absorbed elsewhere, shifted to a different line item, reallocated, managed. There are always ways to manage the numbers if you need to. And that's the thing about long-term contracts. They give you time to make up for delays, time to recover from cost overruns, time to find efficiencies that will balance the ledger, time is flexibility. And flexibility is valuable when you're trying to show profit on work that won't be finished for decades. Asterisk. A junior accountant notices something odd in the monthly report. A project that's behind schedule is still showing its original profit forecast. Shouldn't that be adjusted? A senior colleague explains that adjustments are made quarterly, not monthly, and only when there's clear evidence that the original assumptions were wrong. Right now, the assumptions are still considered valid. The accountant nods and moves on. This is how it works. At the end of the financial year, the board reviews the results. Revenue is up, profit is up. The CEO receives his bonus. The auditors sign off. The annual report is published. Investors are pleased. Analysts are positive. Everything looks fine. And perhaps it is fine. Perhaps the forecasts are accurate. Perhaps the risks are under control. Perhaps the contracts will deliver the profits that have been estimated, or perhaps not. But either way, the documents say what they say. And the documents are what matter. Asterisk. Because here's what nobody wants to admit. In a system built on 30-year contracts and percentage of completion accounting and mutual dependence between government and contractor, the line between reality and representation gets very thin. What is the company actually worth? What are its contracts actually going to deliver? You can't know. You can only estimate. And estimates, unlike buildings, are easy to adjust. You just change the number. You update the assumption. You revise the forecast. And as long as the process has been followed, as long as the auditors have done their work, as long as the disclosure is technically accurate, everything is fine. The invisible organ continues to grow. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Over 420 contracts with the government. Work in Canada, in the Middle East, across Europe. 50,000 employees. Billions in revenue. The annual report lists project after project. Each one a commitment stretching years into the future. Prison maintenance contracts. Hospital construction. Rail infrastructure. The company describes itself as a support services and construction group. What this means in practice is that Carillion has positioned itself as the invisible machinery that keeps public services running. In a hospital corridor at 6 in the morning, a Carillion employee checks the heating system. In a school kitchen, another employee prepares meals for hundreds of children. On a highway, a maintenance crew in Carillion uniforms inspects drainage. None of these people are making headlines. They are doing ordinary work, essential work, the kind of work that only gets noticed when it stops happening. But back at headquarters, a different kind of work is being done. The chief executive stands before investors and speaks about stability, about long-term relationships, about the strength of the order book. The order book is everything. It represents future revenue. Contracts already won but not yet completed. Work that will generate income for years to come. At its peak, Carillion's order book is valued at over £40 billion. It's a number so large it's almost meaningless. But it sounds impressive. It sounds like security. In the accounting community, people are starting to pay attention to Carillion's numbers. Not with alarm exactly, more with curiosity. The company is recognizing significant profits on contracts that have barely begun. This is allowed under accounting standards, even encouraged. If you're confident in your estimates, you should reflect that confidence in your financial statements. But confidence is not the same as certainty. And on a contract that spans decades, certainty is impossible. The auditors continue their work. Each year, they arrive with their checklists and their samples and their questions. They examine the company's assumptions about contract costs, about contract revenues, about risks and contingencies. The process is thorough. Hundreds of hours. are spent reviewing documentation, testing controls, assessing judgments, and each year the conclusion is the same. The financial statements give a true and fair view. But what does that phrase actually mean? True and fair. It doesn't mean the numbers are correct. It doesn't mean the forecasts will prove accurate. It means that the company has followed the rules, that the estimates are not unreasonable, that the disclosure is adequate. It's a statement about process, not outcome. The auditors cannot predict the future. They can only assess whether the company's predictions are supportable. And year after year, they conclude that they are. The share price climbs, not dramatically. This is not a technology stock promising exponential growth. This is a steady, reliable company delivering predictable returns. Pension funds own shares. Institutional investors hold positions. The company pays dividends. Everything about Carillion's presentation says boring, stable, dependable. And boring and stable and dependable is exactly what investors in infrastructure companies want to see. Executive compensation rises. The CEO's package includes salary, bonus, and long-term incentives. The total reaches into the millions. This is justified by the company's size and complexity, by the responsibility involved in managing such a vast operation, by the need to attract and retain talent in a competitive market. The Remuneration Committee approves it. The auditors note it. The shareholders vote on it. Everything is disclosed. Everything is documented. Everything follows the process, and the government keeps awarding contracts. Because what choice does it have? The outsourcing model is now embedded in how Britain delivers public services. To reverse, it would require rebuilding internal capacity that has been deliberately dismantled. Bringing work back in-house would be expensive and time-consuming and politically difficult. The easier path is to continue with the current arrangement, to rely on the partners who are already there, who know the systems, who have the experience. Companies like Carillion. There's a word that starts appearing in internal risk meetings. Concentration. The concern is that Carillion has so much work with the government that both parties are overly dependent on each other. If Carillion struggles, the government has a problem. If the government changes its procurement approach, Carillion has a problem. It's a mutual vulnerability. But the meetings where this is discussed are not urgent. The risk is noted, monitored, added to the register. No action is required because right now, everything is working. Asterisk on a construction site. A project is running 6 months behind schedule. The site manager reports this up the chain. There are reasons, weather, subcontractor delays, design changes. From the client. All legitimate, all documented. The question is what to do about the budget. The original estimate assumed the work would be complete by now. It's not. So costs are higher than planned. Does this mean the total expected profit on the contract needs to be reduced? Not necessarily. The delay might be recoverable. Extensions might be granted. Efficiencies might be found in later phases. The contract has years left to run. It's too early to say whether the delay represents a permanent cost or a temporary timing issue. The prudent thing is to wait for more information, to not overreact to short-term fluctuations, to maintain the current forecast until there's clear evidence it needs to change. This logic is applied across dozens of contracts. Delays happen. Cost overruns occur. But each one is assessed individually. Is this a fundamental problem or a manageable deviation? More often than not, the conclusion is the latter. The forecasts hold. The profit estimates remain unchanged. The financial statements continue to show a healthy, growing business. In a quarterly review meeting, someone raises a question about cash flow. The company is profitable on paper, but the actual cash position seems tight. Why is that? The answer involves something called working capital. On long-term contracts, you often have to spend money before you receive payment. You pay your workers. You pay your suppliers. Then, according to the agreed schedule, you invoice the client and wait for payment. This creates a timing gap. A gap that has to be funded somehow. Carillion funds it through a mixture of bank facilities and careful management of payables. The company has negotiated long payment terms with its suppliers. It pays them in 60 days, 90 days, sometimes longer. This means Carillion can receive payment from clients before it has to pay its own bills. It's a way of using other people's money to bridge the cash flow gap. Suppliers grumble about it, but they accept it because Carillion is a major customer. Losing Carillion's business would be worse than waiting for payment. This approach works as long as the contracts keep coming, as long as revenue keeps flowing in. But it creates a kind of structural dependency. Carillion needs new contracts, not just for the future profit they represent, but for the immediate cash they provide. The company is running on a treadmill. It has to keep moving forward or it falls. A new contract is announced. A hospital in Liverpool. The press release describes it as a partnership to deliver world-class healthcare facilities. The contract value is £300 million. The margin is expected to be healthy. This is good news. Proof that Carillion remains competitive. That the business model is sound. The share price ticks up slightly on the announcement, but if you read the fine print of that contract, you see something interesting. Carillion is not actually building the hospital for £300 million. That's the total value over the life of the contract, which includes 25 years of maintenance and facilities management after construction is complete. The construction phase itself is much less profitable. The real money is in the long-term service provision. The work that comes after the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The unglamorous, essential, day-to-day maintenance that keeps a building functioning. And here's the thing about maintenance contracts. They require constant attention, constant cost control. You've agreed to provide a service for a fixed price over decades. If your costs rise faster than you anticipated, your profit disappears. If equipment fails earlier than expected, you have to replace it at your own expense. The risk doesn't go away after you win the contract. It just changes form. Asterisk. Inside Carillion's finance department, analysts track these risks on spreadsheets. Each contract has a risk register. Each risk has a probability and an impact. Red risks, amber risks, green risks. The system is comprehensive, detailed, professional. It gives the impression of control. But control is different from certainty. You can identify a risk without being able to prevent it. You can quantify a risk without being able to eliminate it. An internal audit is conducted. Not by the external auditors, but by Carillion's own internal audit team. They review contract management processes. They interview project managers. They test controls. The report identifies some weaknesses. Nothing catastrophic. Just areas for improvement. Better documentation. More timely reporting. Stronger oversight. The recommendations are accepted. An action plan is created. Progress will be monitored. This is how large organizations function. Continuous improvement. Lessons learned. Adjustments made. The system is self-correcting. Or at least, it's supposed to be. At an industry conference, Carillion's chief financial officer gives a presentation about managing complex contracts. He speaks about governance, about risk management frameworks, about the importance of conservative assumptions. The audience nods. These are the right things to say, the reassuring things, and to be fair, he probably believes them. The frameworks exist. The assumptions are documented. From inside the system, everything looks reasonable, but there's a gap. A gap between how things look on paper and how they work in practice. On paper, Carillion has robust processes for estimating contract costs. In practice, those estimates are produced by people who are measured on their ability to win work and deliver profit. The incentives create pressure, not to lie exactly, just to be optimistic, to assume the best-case scenario, to believe that this time things will go according to plan. And sometimes they do. Some contracts deliver exactly what was forecast. The building gets finished on time and on budget. The maintenance costs come in as expected. The profit is real. But other contracts don't. They run over. They underperform. They hit unexpected problems. And when that happens, the question is whether to adjust the forecast or to wait and see if things improve. More often than not, the decision is to wait. Because adjusting the forecast means admitting you were wrong. It means taking a charge against earnings. It means explaining to investors why the numbers have changed. It's painful, embarrassing, career limiting. Much easier to give it another quarter, another year, to hope that the situation resolves itself. This is not fraud. Nobody is deliberately inventing numbers. But it's not quite honesty either. It's something in between, a kind of institutional optimism. A belief that problems are temporary and solutions are just around the corner. And as long as that belief can be maintained, the forecasts don't change. The external auditors come back. They sample contracts. They review management's estimates. They assess whether the assumptions are supportable. And here's the thing about audit testing. You can't check everything. There are too many contracts, too many judgments. So you select a sample. You test the process. You verify that the controls are in place. If the process looks sound, you conclude that the numbers are probably okay. Probably. That word carries a lot of weight. Auditing is not about certainty. It's about reasonable assurance. And reasonable assurance means there's a chance you're wrong. A chance that the numbers you're signing off on are not quite right. But that's the nature of the work. You do your best with the information available, and you issue your opinion. The opinion is issued. Clean. Unqualified. The financial statements give a true and fair view. Investors can rely on them. Lenders can rely on them. The government can rely on them. Everything is fine. And perhaps it is. Perhaps all the profit forecasts will prove accurate. Perhaps all the contracts will deliver as expected. Perhaps the risks are under control and the processes are working and the assumptions are sound. Or perhaps there's already a crack in the foundation. A crack that's being papered over with updated forecasts and revised assumptions and careful wording in the annual report. A crack that's small now but growing. In a meeting room, someone asks whether the company is taking on too much work, whether the pace of growth is sustainable. The question is acknowledged but not fully answered. Growth is the strategy. Growth is what investors expect. Growth is how executives get their bonuses. Slowing down is not an option. Not when the order book is full and the contracts keep coming. And the share price is holding steady. So the machine keeps running. The contracts keep getting signed. The forecasts keep getting made. The audits keep getting completed. The reports keep getting published. Everything looks fine from the outside. Stable, professional, under control. And maybe it is, or maybe it's not. But either way, the documents say what they say. And the documents are what matter. The golden age continues. For now, July 2016, the company issues a profit warning. Revenue is going to be lower than expected. Profit margins on certain contracts are under pressure. The language is careful, technical. The announcement talks about challenging market conditions, about delayed client decisions, about contract complexities. The message is clear enough, though. The numbers are not going to be what we said they would be. The share price drops. Not catastrophically, about 20% in a single day. Analysts scramble to update their models. Investors call for explanations. The company schedules a conference call. The chief executive speaks in measured tones about near-term headwinds and medium-term opportunities. He emphasizes that this is a temporary issue, that the underlying business remains sound, that the order book is still strong. The fundamentals have not changed, but something has changed. The market's confidence has been shaken. For years, Carillion presented itself as predictable, reliable, the kind of company where surprises didn't happen. And now there's been a surprise, a significant one. And if this surprise was possible, what other surprises might be waiting? Inside the company, emergency meetings are convened. Finance teams work through the weekend reviewing every major contract. The question being asked is simple but urgent. How bad is it really? The review identifies several contracts that are performing worse than forecast. Construction projects where costs have overrun significantly. Maintenance contracts where the work is more intensive than anticipated. The losses are real. They need to be recognized. But there's a second question. How much needs to be recognized right now? The accounting rules allow for judgment. If a contract is expected to be loss-making over its lifetime, you have to recognize that loss immediately. But if a contract is just going through a difficult period and is still expected to be profitable overall, you can spread the impact over time. The question is which category each contract falls into. The discussions are intense. Project managers argue that their contracts will recover, that the cost overruns are one-time issues, that efficiencies will be found in later phases. The finance team pushes back. Where's the evidence? What's changed? Why should we believe the new forecast when the old forecast was wrong? Eventually, decisions are made. Some contracts are written down. Others are left alone. The total impact is hundreds of millions of pounds. It's significant, but not devastating. The company is still profitable, still solvent, still operating. The profit warning is issued, and the market reacts, and gradually things stabilize. But internally, the mood has shifted. There's a new cautiousness, a new awareness that the forecasts everyone relied on were not as solid as they seemed. Questions are being asked that weren't asked before, about governance, about oversight, about how contracts are estimated and monitored and reported. A consulting firm is brought in to review processes. They spend weeks interviewing staff and examining documentation and mapping workflows. Their report identifies gaps. The contract review process is not robust enough. Risk escalation procedures are unclear. There's insufficient challenge of management assumptions. The recommendations are sensible. Strengthen the project management office. Enhance financial controls. Increase board oversight. Action plans are created. Responsibility is assigned. Deadlines are set. The board receives regular updates on implementation. It's all very professional, very thorough. The kind of response you would expect from a well-managed company that has learned from a mistake. But underneath the professional response, there's a more fundamental problem. The company's business model requires optimistic forecasting. You can't win contracts if you assume everything will go wrong. You can't show growth if you're overly conservative in your estimates. There's a tension between prudence and competitiveness, between realism and ambition. And that tension doesn't go away just because you've improved your processes. September 2016. A new chief executive is appointed. The previous one has stepped down. Not fired exactly. Just decided it's time to move on. The new CEO comes from within the company. He knows the business. He knows the contracts. He's been part of the leadership team that got the company to this point. Some investors question whether an internal appointment is the right choice, whether fresh eyes might be needed. But the board has confidence in him. He understands Carillion. He can steer it through this difficult period. His first priority is to restore market confidence. He gives interviews emphasizing the strength of the order book, the quality of the client relationships, the technical expertise of the workforce. He talks about refocusing on core markets, about being more selective in bidding, about discipline. These are the right messages, reassuring messages. Behind the scenes, the cash position is becoming a concern. The profit warning has made banks nervous. Credit lines that were routine to renew are now subject to more scrutiny, more conditions, higher fees. The company needs cash to operate, to pay suppliers, to fund the working capital on ongoing contracts. But cash is getting tighter. A decision is made. The dividend will be maintained. This is important for signaling. Cutting the dividend would suggest the company is in real trouble. It would further damage confidence. Better to keep paying shareholders, even if it means the cash reserves get a bit thinner. It's a trade-off. Short-term cash pressure versus long-term credibility. The auditors are back for the year-end audit. This time, the process is different, more intense. The audit partner wants more evidence, more documentation, more explanation of key judgments. The firm's national office is involved. Quality reviewers are looking over everything. There's an awareness that this audit will be scrutinized, that if something goes wrong later, questions will be asked about what the auditors did or didn't do. The contract reviews take longer. Sample sizes are increased. Assumptions are challenged. Management provides explanations, additional analysis, sensitivity calculations showing what would happen under different scenarios. Eventually, the auditors are satisfied. Not completely comfortable, perhaps, but satisfied that the numbers are supportable, that the judgments are within acceptable bounds. The audit opinion is issued. Unqualified. The financial statements give a true and fair view. The company's external reporting says it has learned from the profit warning, that controls have been strengthened, that the business is stabilizing. Investors who stayed through the turbulence are told their patience will be rewarded. But January 2017 brings another profit warning. More contracts are underperforming. The expected recovery hasn't materialized. Costs on certain projects are higher than the revised forecasts from just months earlier. The announcement tries to contain the damage. These are specific issues on specific contracts, not a systemic problem. But the market doesn't see it that way. The share price falls again. Harder this time. Analysts to start using words like serial disappointer. Institutional investors begin reducing their positions. The credit rating agencies put the company on watch for a downgrade. And inside Carillion, there's a growing realization that this is not just a bad patch. This is something more serious. The finance team runs scenarios. What if we lose another major contract? What if banks reduce our facilities? What if suppliers demand faster payment? The numbers in the scenarios are not reassuring. The company's financial position is more fragile than it appears. The buffer between operating normally and facing a crisis is thinner than anyone wants to admit. But publicly, the message remains controlled, calm. The CEO speaks about transformation, about reshaping the business, about focusing on cash generation. A restructuring plan is announced. Costs will be cut. Underperforming contracts will be exited where possible. The business will be right-sized. These are difficult decisions, but necessary ones. Employees start to worry. Restructuring means redundancies. It means uncertainty. People who have worked for Carillion for years suddenly don't know if they'll have a job in 6 months. Morale drops. Good people start looking elsewhere. Clients notice the instability and begin asking questions. Are you going to be able to complete our project? Should we be concerned? Carillion tries to win new work to stabilize the situation. New contracts mean new cash, new revenue to offset the problems on old contracts. But bidding is harder now. Clients are wary. Competitors sense weakness and bid more aggressively. The contracts Carillion does win are lower margin, more competitive, less profitable. The quality of the order book is deteriorating even as the company tries to rebuild it. In a board meeting, the discussion turns to whether the company should seek new equity, raise capital from investors to strengthen the balance sheet. It's a logical option, but it would require admitting just how serious the situation is, and it would massively dilute existing shareholders. The share price is already down 70% from its peak. Issuing new shares at the current price would destroy what little value remains. The decision is deferred. Meanwhile, suppliers are getting nervous. Payment terms that were already long are stretching longer. Phone calls go unreturned. Invoices go unpaid past their due dates. Some smaller suppliers face their own cash crises because Carillion owes them money and isn't paying. A few stop working. They can't afford to keep providing services they're not being paid for. Carillion threatens legal action for breach of contract. The threats are mostly empty, but they buy time. The company's pension deficit is another problem that keeps growing. Like many established British companies, Carillion has a defined benefit pension scheme for employees. The scheme is underfunded. The gap between what has been promised to pensioners and what the scheme actually holds is measured in hundreds of millions of pounds. Normally, this would be addressed gradually over years. But normal times are ending. July 2017. Another profit. Warning: the third in 12 months. This one is different though. This one includes a fundamental restatement. The company is writing down the value of contracts by £845 million. Nearly £1 billion of expected future profit is being erased from the books. The contracts were never going to deliver what was forecast. The assumptions were wrong. The estimates were too optimistic. The reality is being recognized. The announcement also reveals that the company is in discussions with its banks and its pension trustees. Discussions is a careful word. What it really means is negotiations. The banks are worried about their exposure. The pension trustees are worried about the deficit. Everyone is worried about whether Carillion can survive. The share price collapses, down another 40%. The market capitalization of the entire company is now less than the value of the write-downs just announced. Investors have lost billions. Pension funds that held Carillion shares as safe, stable infrastructure investments are facing losses they never anticipated. And the auditors face questions. How did this happen? How were financial statements signed off as giving a true and fair view when nearly £1 billion of profit was imaginary? The audit firm issues a statement. The write-downs relate to judgments about future performance. At the time of previous audits, those judgments were supportable based on available information. Circumstances have changed. Management's estimates have been revised. This is not an audit failure, but the public doesn't see it that way. The public sees a company that claimed to be profitable when it wasn't. Financial statements that turned out to be wrong. Auditors who signed off on those statements. And a gap between what was reported and what was real. A gap of nearly £1 billion. Inside Carillion, the focus has shifted entirely to survival. The transformation plan is now a rescue plan. Assets are being sold. Businesses are being divested. Anything that can generate cash is being monetized. but it's not enough. The hole is too deep. The contracts that were supposed to be the foundation of the business are actually liabilities. They're consuming cash rather than generating it. Executive bonuses become a scandal. While the company was issuing profit warnings and writing down contracts, senior executives were still receiving millions in compensation. Some of it was deferred from earlier years when performance looked good. Some of it was contractual. But the optics are terrible. The CEO who presided over the profit warnings received over £1.5 million in 2016. His successor is on track for similar amounts. Meanwhile, employees are being made redundant and suppliers aren't being paid. Asterisk. The government is watching all of this with growing alarm. Carillion holds too many critical contracts. Hospitals, schools, prisons. If the company fails, those services are at risk. Contingency planning begins. Quietly, what would we do if Carillion collapsed? Who would take over the contracts? How would we ensure continuity of services? But the planning is complicated by the fact that Carillion's contracts are so numerous and so varied. There's no single entity that could step in and take them all. It would have to be coordinated. Multiple companies, government departments working together. It would be messy and expensive and time-consuming. Better if Carillion can be saved. November 2017. The company announces it's in talks about a financial restructuring. The banks might provide new lending. The pension scheme might accept delayed payments. Existing debt might be converted to equity. It's all very complicated and very uncertain. The company needs all these pieces to fall into place. If any one of them fails, the whole thing collapses. The deadline for reaching agreement is set for mid-January 2018. 2 months to negotiate with banks and pension, trustees and government and reach a deal that saves the company. 2 months to avoid catastrophe. The employees wait. The suppliers wait. The clients wait. And in the corridors of power, officials prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. The invisible organ is failing. Everyone can see it now. The question is whether it can be saved or whether something else will have to take its place. The clock is ticking. January 15th, 2018. The talks have failed. The banks will not provide additional lending. The terms being demanded are too severe. The restructuring cannot proceed. At 7 in the morning, Carillion's board convenes an emergency meeting. The options are reviewed one final time. There are no good options left. Just one option. The board votes unanimously. The company will enter compulsory liquidation. At 7:43, the announcement is released to the stock exchange. Carillion has ceased trading. An official receiver has been appointed. All operations are under the control of the insolvency service. The statement is brief, clinical. It uses the passive voice extensively. Steps are being taken. Services will be maintained. Employees should report to work as normal. But the core message is simple. Britain's second largest construction company has collapsed. The auditors are back for the year-end audit. The reaction is immediate. The share price, already nearly worthless, drops to zero. Shareholders have lost everything. The pension scheme, already underfunded, now faces a gap of nearly £1 billion. Suppliers who are owed money join a queue of creditors that stretches into the thousands. The amount owed is staggering. £7 billion of liabilities, less than £1 billion in assets. The gap will never be closed. On construction sites across the country, work stops. Access cards stop working. Gates are locked. Workers arrive for their Monday morning shift and are told to go home. Some sites are simply abandoned. Materials left where they were placed. Equipment sitting idle. Partially completed buildings standing empty. In one hospital, a wing under construction will remain unfinished for years. a monument to interrupted ambition. But for some contracts, stopping is not an option. A hospital cannot simply close because its facilities management contractor has collapsed. A prison cannot cease operating. Schools cannot shut their doors. These are public services, essential services. They must continue regardless of who's providing them. Emergency protocols are activated. The government has been preparing for this possibility, but preparation is different from execution. Cabinet office officials work through the night coordinating responses. Each contract has to be assessed. Which ones are critical? Which contractors can step in? How quickly can transitions happen? The scale is overwhelming. Carillion was involved in around 420 public sector contracts. Each one now needs a new arrangement. For the hospital contracts, the solution is to bring management back in-house temporarily. NHS trusts take direct control of facilities that Carillion was running. Existing Carillion employees are offered jobs with the NHS to ensure continuity. It's messy, but it works. The heating stays on. The meals get served. Patients don't notice the change. But the cost to the public purse is significant. Services that were being provided under fixed-price contracts now have to be delivered at actual cost. And actual cost is higher. For construction projects, the situation is more complex. Some are abandoned. The clients will have to find new contractors and start again. Others are taken over midstream. The new contractor has to assess what work has been completed, what has been paid for, what materials are on site, what the actual progress is versus what was reported. Often, they find discrepancies. Work that Carillion claimed was 90% complete is actually closer to 70%. Materials that were supposed to be on site were never delivered. The gap between reported progress and actual progress costs money to fix. Employees face immediate uncertainty. 43,000 people worked for Carillion worldwide. Roughly 19,000 in the UK. On the day of liquidation, none of them know if they still have jobs. Some are quickly rehired by the companies taking over contracts. Others are made redundant within days. The government announces a redundancy processing service to help, but processing takes time. And people have mortgages, bills, families to support. One former project manager describes arriving at the office on Monday morning to find the doors locked and a notice taped to the glass. He had worked for the company for 16 years, had a wife and 2 children, a mortgage. The redundancy payment he's eventually entitled to will be paid by the government's insolvency service, not by Carillion. It's capped at a few £100 per week. After 16 years of service, the payout is less than he would have earned in 3 months. The suppliers face disaster. Thousands of small and medium-sized businesses are owed money by Carillion. Money for work already completed, for materials already delivered, for services already provided. They will never see most of it. In liquidation, unsecured creditors typically receive pennies on the pound, if anything. Some of these suppliers are themselves forced into insolvency because Carillion's collapse takes down their own cash flow. One small electrical contractor owed £200,000 goes bust within a month. 3 generations of the same family had run that business. It's gone now. The banks, interestingly, do somewhat better. They hold security over certain assets. They have priority in the liquidation. They won't get everything they're owed, but they'll get a significant portion. This is how secured debt works. You take less risk because you have a claim on specific assets. But it means that when things go wrong, the banks get paid before the suppliers who actually did the work. Parliament demands answers. Select committees. Launch inquiries. Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee. Work and Pensions Committee. They issue summonses. Former executives are called to testify. The auditors are called. the pension trustees, the regulators. Everyone involved in Carillion's governance and oversight has to explain what happened. The hearings are uncomfortable. Members of Parliament are angry. The public is angry. 16,000 jobs gone. Public services disrupted. Taxpayers on the hook for the cleanup. And yet the people who ran the company walked away with millions. The former CEO, who left in 2016 as the profit warnings began, took home over £1.5 million in his final year. He receives a pension of over £25,000 per month for life. While the company's pension scheme is nearly £1 billion in deficit, his successor, who presided over the final collapse, also received substantial compensation. Base salary, bonuses, share awards. Some of the bonuses were discretionary. They could have been withheld. They were paid anyway. The remuneration committee felt contractually obligated, or perhaps just unwilling to confront the optics. Either way, the money was paid. And now, in front of Parliament, the executives have to defend it. They try. They speak about having worked hard, about difficult circumstances, about the complexity of the business, about decisions made in good faith. The MPs are not sympathetic. One asks directly how he can justify taking bonuses while the company was failing. The answer is technical, convoluted. It convinces no one. The auditors face equally harsh questioning. KPMG had been Carillion's auditor for 19 years. 19 consecutive years of sighing off on the accounts. 19 years of fees totaling millions of pounds. And at the end of those 19 years, the company collapsed with nearly £1 billion of value that turned out not to exist. How did that happen? The audit partner tries to explain. Auditing is about reasonable assurance, not absolute certainty. Judgments about long-term contracts are inherently uncertain. The standards allow for management estimates. The auditors tested those estimates at the time and found them supportable. Circumstances changed. New information emerged. This is not audit failure, but the MPs pushed back. KPMG had a very close relationship with Carillion. They did the audit. They also provided consulting services, advisory work. The fees for non-audit services were substantial. Didn't that create a conflict? Didn't that compromise independence? The auditor denies it. The audit and consulting work were kept separate. Different teams, different partners. Proper safeguards were in place. The accounting regulator, the Financial Reporting Council, announces its own investigation. They will examine whether KPMG's audits met professional standards, whether appropriate skepticism was applied, whether the judgments about Carillion's contracts were adequately challenged. The investigation will take years. Eventually, it will conclude that the audits were deficient in multiple respects. KPMG will face a record fine. Individual partners will be sanctioned, but all of that comes later. Right now, in January 2018, the focus is just on understanding what happened online. Forums and social media are less restrained than official inquiries. Carillion is called a Ponzi scheme, a house of cards, a fraud. Some of the characterizations are unfair. There was no deliberate deception in the way the term usually implies. Nobody was inventing fake contracts or falsifying documents. But the broader point resonates. The company was recognizing profit that didn't exist, using new contracts to generate cash to cover losses on old contracts, paying dividends it couldn't afford. It had the structure of a legitimate business, but the dynamics of something less sustainable. The directors reject the comparison. This was a real business with real contracts doing real work. The accounting was in accordance with the rules. The auditors signed off. The regulators didn't intervene. Everything was disclosed. If there were problems with the business model or the accounting standards, That's a systemic issue, not a fraud. And they have a point. Carillion's accounts were not works of fiction. They were constructed according to accepted accounting standards, reviewed by qualified auditors, published and distributed, and relied upon by sophisticated investors. The problem was not that the rules were broken. The problem was that the rules allowed a version of reality to be presented that diverged dramatically from the underlying truth. The pension scheme becomes a political issue. Nearly 30,000 people are members of Carillion's pension scheme. Most of them are not wealthy. They're electricians, maintenance workers, cleaners, administrative staff. They worked for decades with the promise of a secure retirement. That promise is now in jeopardy. The scheme will enter the Pension Protection Fund, which means benefits will be paid, but at a reduced level. For some retirees, the reduction is 20% or more. That's the difference between a comfortable retirement and a difficult one. The government faces criticism for continuing to award contracts to Carillion even after the profit warnings, even when the financial distress was becoming apparent. But officials defend the decision. They argue that stopping contracts would have precipitated collapse earlier, that supporting Carillion was an attempt to allow time for restructuring, that the alternative of allowing failure sooner might have been worse. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps the government's strategy bought valuable time, or perhaps it threw good money after bad, poured public funds into a company that was already doomed, allowed the problem to grow larger before it finally detonated. The counterfactual is unknowable. History only runs once. What is known as the cost. The National Audit Office eventually calculates that Carillion's failure cost taxpayers at least £150 million in additional expenses. Contract transitions, emergency measures, redundancy payments. That's the direct cost. The indirect costs are harder to measure. Delayed projects, disrupted services, lost confidence in outsourcing models. These ripple out in ways that don't appear in budget lines, but are real nonetheless. For the 18 months before the collapse, Carillion was kept alive partly by government support. New contracts were awarded. Payment terms were accelerated. The Cabinet Office was coordinating with departments to ensure Carillion had enough cash flow to continue operating. This was not secret. It was not a bailout in the traditional sense, but it was a form of life support. The government knew the company was fragile and made decisions to sustain it. Critics argue this was a mistake, that the government became complicit in propping up a failing company, that taxpayer money was used to delay the inevitable. Defenders argue that the alternative was unthinkable, that allowing Carillion to fail earlier would have created chaos, that the time bought by continued support was used to prepare contingency plans. Both arguments have merit. The situation was genuinely difficult. There were no good options, only less bad ones. And when a company has made itself indispensable to the functioning of public services, the government's choices are constrained. It cannot simply let it fail and walk away. It has to manage the consequences. And the consequences are being managed. Slowly, painfully. The liquidation process will take years. The official receiver's reports detail the complexity. Contracts in dozens of countries. Joint ventures, partnerships, subsidiaries. The corporate structure was labyrinthine. Unwinding it is a massive undertaking. Some of Carillion's overseas. Businesses are sold as going concerns. Buyers are found who take over the contracts and the employees. The proceeds go to creditors, but they don't go far. The amounts recovered are a fraction of the amounts owed. In the UK, the focus remains on public services. Making sure hospitals continue to operate. Making sure schools stay open. Making sure prisoners remain secure. The immediate crisis is managed. But the longer-term question lingers. How did this happen? How did a major government contractor become so financially distressed without anyone stopping it? The answer is uncomfortable. Lots of people knew Carillion was in trouble. The banks knew. The government knew. The auditors had concerns, even if they couldn't prove the accounts were wrong. The credit rating agencies had downgraded the company. Analysts were writing negative reports. None of this was secret. It was all public information. But knowing something is different from doing something. And doing something would have been difficult, complicated, risky. Easier to hope that the company would pull through, that the restructuring would succeed, that this was just a rough patch and not a terminal decline. Hope is not a strategy. But, in the absence of good alternatives, it's what everyone relied on. And when hope finally ran out, when the last negotiations failed and there were no more cards to play, the collapse was sudden but not surprising. Everyone had seen it coming. They just didn't know exactly when. Now they know. January 15th, 2018. The day the invisible organ stopped beating. The day the documents could no longer substitute for reality. The day the whole elaborate structure of estimates and forecasts and carefully worded assurances came apart. The work sites are silent. The corporate offices are being cleared. The share certificates are worthless paper. And in Whitehall, officials are asking themselves how to make sure this never happens again. Whether it's even possible to make sure. Whether the system that created Carillion is fundamentally broken or just needs adjustment. Whether outsourcing can work or whether this was proof it cannot. These questions will take years to answer. If they can be answered at all, the hearing rooms are different now. The same corridors but a different tone. It's March 2018 and the Joint Committee on the Collapse of Carillion is in session. The nameplate in front of each witness is formal, centered. The questions being asked are versions of the same question asked in different ways. Who knew what? When did they know it? What did they do about it? And why wasn't it enough? The answers come slowly, carefully, with qualifications and caveats and references to complexity. A former chief executive explains that he relied on professional advisors, that the accounts were audited, that the board received regular reports, that decisions were made in good faith based on available information. The committee members listen, take notes. Their expressions suggest they are not convinced. The audit partner returns to familiar ground. The standards were followed. The work was thorough. Hindsight is not a basis for criticism. Auditing cannot predict the future. It can only assess whether judgments at a point in time were reasonable. And at each point in time, the judgments appeared reasonable, until they weren't. A pension trustee testifies about the deficit, about negotiations with the company over funding, about the challenge of balancing the needs of active employees against retired members, about the hope that the business would recover and the scheme would be made whole. That hope was not realized. 27,000 people will receive reduced pensions because of it. The Cabinet Office sends senior officials. They explain the contingency planning that was done, the support that was provided, the contracts that were awarded during the period of distress. They defend these decisions as necessary to prevent earlier collapse. The committee asks whether that support was wise, whether taxpayer money should have been used to extend the life of a failing company. The officials say the alternative would have been worse. Perhaps we'll never know. What emerges from weeks of testimony is not a conspiracy, but something more mundane and more troubling. A system that functioned exactly as designed, but produced catastrophic outcomes. The accounting rules were followed. The audit standards were met. The governance procedures were documented. The risk management frameworks existed. And yet a company with billions in liabilities and minimal assets was presenting itself as profitable and sustainable right up until it wasn't. The financial Reporting Council releases its interim findings in May. KPMG's audits of Carillion's 2014, 2015, and 2016 accounts are under investigation for potential breaches of professional standards. The areas of concern include revenue recognition on long-term contracts, assessment of going concern, and evaluation of goodwill. Each of these involves judgment. Each of these was signed off. Each of these now appears questionable, but the investigation takes time. Audit working papers have to be reviewed. Standards have to be interpreted. Witnesses have to be interviewed. It's a technical process, thorough, fair, and slow. It will be 2019 before the full conclusions are published. By then, public attention will have moved on. The government announces a review of outsourcing. A cross-departmental working group is formed. Their mandate is to examine what went wrong and recommend changes. The review takes months. Consultations are held. Experts provide input. Industry bodies make submissions. Eventually, a report is produced. It makes sensible recommendations. Better financial monitoring of contractors. More diversification of suppliers. Earlier intervention when problems emerge. Improved contract management capabilities within government. Some of the recommendations are implemented. New procurement rules are introduced. Contractors bidding for major government work now face enhanced financial scrutiny. Credit checks are more rigorous. Reporting requirements are expanded. It's all reasonable, professional, and appropriate. Response to lessons learned, but the fundamental model remains unchanged. The government still outsources, still relies on private contractors to deliver public services, still signs long-term contracts with fixed prices and transferred risk, because the alternative would require rebuilding internal capacity that has been systematically dismantled over decades. And that would be expensive and politically difficult and time-consuming. So, new contractors step into the space Carillion left. They bid on the same types of contracts. They make the same promises about efficiency and quality and value for money. They use similar accounting treatments for long-term contracts. They are audited by the same firms using the same standards. The nameplate on the door has changed, but the system is largely the same. One of the contracts Carillion was working on when it collapsed was a hospital in Liverpool. After the liquidation, a new contractor was found to complete the work. The project was already years behind schedule and over budget when Carillion failed. The new contractor assessed the situation and revised the estimates. Completion was pushed back further. Costs increased further. The hospital eventually opened in 2022, 4 years late. Millions over budget, but it opened. Services are being delivered. From that perspective, the system worked. Eventually, the pension scheme's entry into the Pension Protection Fund means reduced benefits, but not eliminated benefits. Members still receive pensions, just less than they were promised. For someone who retired expecting £16,000 per year, they now receive £13,000. It's the difference between security and worry, between maintaining a standard of living and slowly declining, but they receive something. The system caught them. Partially. The suppliers who were owed money received, on average, about 3 pence for every pound owed. The liquidation process distributed what assets existed according to the priority rules. Secured creditors first, then preferential creditors, then unsecured creditors sharing what little remained. For a small business owed £50,000, receiving £1,500 is not nothing. But it's not survival either. The regulatory response extends beyond procurement. The accounting standard setters review the rules on long-term contract accounting. Should revenue recognition be less aggressive? Should there be more conservative triggers for recognizing profit? Should going concern assessments be more rigorous? Working groups are formed. Exposure drafts are issued. Comments are solicited. Changes are proposed. Some are implemented. Some are watered down. Some are abandoned. The standards evolve incrementally. The audit profession conducts its own soul-searching. Industry bodies publish papers on professional skepticism, on the importance of challenging management, on the risks of long relationships between auditors and clients. Training materials are updated. Quality control processes are enhanced. The Big Four firms issue statements about lessons learned and commitments to improvement. KPMG faces consequences. When the FRC investigation concludes, the findings are damning. The audits failed to adequately challenge management's assumptions on contract revenue and costs. The going concern assessments were insufficient given the obvious financial stress. Goodwill impairment testing was inadequate. The firm is fined £15 million. 3 individual partners are fined and suspended from practice. It's the largest sanction the FRC has ever imposed. It makes headlines, briefly, but £15 million is less than KPMG earned in fees from Carillion over the years. The firm remains one of the Big Four. It continues to audit major companies. It continues to win new clients. The partners who were sanctioned are not partners anymore, but the firm carries on because the market for audit services is concentrated. There are only 4 firms capable of auditing the largest companies. Losing one would reduce choice further. So the system absorbs the scandal and continues. Parliament's final report on Carillion is published in May 2018. It's scathing. The title is Carillion, a cautionary tale. The summary describes recklessness and greed on the part of directors, dereliction of duty by the auditors, regulatory failure by oversight bodies, complicity by government in keeping a failing company alive. The tone is angry, disillusioned. The recommendations are extensive. Stronger corporate governance, better audit regulation, reformed accounting standards, more effective insolvency processes. Some recommendations are implemented. Some are partially implemented. Some are noted and filed. The challenge with systemic reform is that it requires coordination across multiple institutions. Parliament can recommend, but it cannot directly enforce. The government can legislate, but implementation requires regulatory capacity. Regulators can write rules, but they depend on resources and political support. Each piece moves at its own pace. What doesn't change is the basic tension at the heart of the story. The tension between short-term incentives and long-term sustainability. Between the pressure to show profit and the discipline to recognize reality. Between the desire to believe optimistic forecasts and the responsibility to challenge them. These tensions exist in every company, in every board meeting, in every audit. They don't go away because of new rules or better oversight. They are managed imperfectly. The construction sites that Carillion abandoned have been cleared now, the equipment removed, the materials salvaged or discarded. New contractors have moved in where projects were viable. Other sites remain empty. In some cases, the projects were simply canceled. The need that justified them no longer seemed urgent enough to justify the cost of restarting. So the partially built structures stand as reminders, visible evidence of interrupted plans. But most of Carillion's legacy is invisible. The hospital maintenance contracts that were taken in-house. The school facilities now run by different companies. The roads maintained under new arrangements. To the users of these services, nothing changed. Or rather, everything changed behind the scenes, but the services continued. The heating still works. The meals are still served. The roads are still maintained. From that perspective, the system proved resilient. Yet resilience came at a cost. The taxpayers funded the transition. The employees lost jobs and pensions. The suppliers lost money. The shareholders lost investments. These losses are real, even if they don't disrupt public services. They represent wealth destroyed, security undermined, trust damaged. And trust, once damaged, is difficult to rebuild. Public opinion on outsourcing shifted. Polling after Carillion's collapse showed declining confidence in the model. More people questioned whether private companies should be delivering public services, whether the promised efficiencies were real or illusory, whether the risks of failure were worth the potential savings. The political consensus that supported outsourcing for decades began to fray. Some local authorities brought services back in-house: facilities management, waste collection, maintenance work. The decisions were made quietly, without fanfare. Just a change in who employs the workers and how the budget is allocated. The services continue, but the ideology shifts from market solutions back toward public provision. Carillion's shadow stretches into procurement decisions years later. In September 2020, the liquidation process is still ongoing. The official receiver's reports continue to be published quarterly. Each one details progress made, assets sold, distributions to creditors, legal actions pending. The reports are thorough, technical. They document the slow dismantling of what was once Britain's second largest construction company. The process will eventually close. The final distributions will be made. The case will be archived. But that hasn't happened yet. The former executives have moved on. Some have retired. Some have taken new positions. Their pensions are secure. Their homes were not at risk. The consequences they faced were professional and reputational, not financial. They testified. They were criticized. They were sanctioned in some cases, but they were not prosecuted. Because what they did, though it led to disaster, was not clearly criminal, reckless perhaps, incompetent possibly, but illegal? The evidence for that was not there. The system that produced Carillion still exists, modified, chastened, more cautious perhaps, but fundamentally similar. Long-term contracts are still being signed. Revenue is still being recognized based on estimates of future performance. Auditors are still providing assurance based on testing and judgment rather than certainty. Companies are still making themselves essential to government operations. The risks have not been eliminated. They have been renamed, repackaged, transferred to new entities, with new management and slightly different processes. And perhaps that's inevitable. Perhaps perfect safety is impossible in a system that depends on forecasting the future and trusting organizations to deliver on multi-decade commitments. Perhaps some level of failure is the price of outsourcing. The question is whether the benefits justify the costs, whether the efficiencies gained outweigh the disasters incurred, whether this is the least bad way to deliver public services, or whether better alternatives exist. Those questions remain unanswered. Or rather, they are answered differently depending on who you ask. The consultants who advise on outsourcing believe in the model. The unions who represent workers are skeptical. The politicians who make procurement decisions weigh the trade-offs according to their priorities. The public that receives the services mostly doesn't think about it until something goes wrong. In Whitehall, the corridors are the same corridors where the story began. The fluorescent lights still hum. The printers still eject warm sheets of paper. Officials still move between meetings carrying briefing documents and updated projections. The language has changed slightly. There's more talk of resilience now, of supplier diversity, of early warning indicators. But the fundamental work continues. Contracts are awarded. Relationships are managed. Risks are monitored. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet or a digital archive, There are documents from January 2018, the internal briefings that were turned over and over, the red annotations circling going concern, the emergency meeting minutes, the contingency plans that were activated. These documents exist as evidence, as warning, as reminder. But documents, like memories, fade. New crises arrive. Attention moves on. The lessons are noted and filed and gradually forgotten until the next time. Because there will be a next time. Perhaps not exactly like Carillion. Perhaps in a different sector or a different form. But the dynamics that produced Carillion's collapse have not been eliminated. The incentives that encouraged optimistic forecasting remain. The accounting rules that allowed divergence between reported profit and economic reality are still in place, only slightly amended. The audit process that provided assurance without certainty continues. The mutual dependence between government and contractors persists. The invisible organ has been replaced. Different companies now perform the functions Carillion performed. They maintain hospitals. They build schools. They provide services that citizens depend on. And they are trusted to do so because the alternative is unthinkable. Because the government cannot instantly rebuild the capacity it spent decades dismantling. Because the system requires trust to function. And so the trust is extended, cautiously, with more oversight than before, with more monitoring and more checks and more scrutiny, but still extended. Because there is no choice. The schools need to be built. The hospitals need to be maintained. The services need to continue. And someone has to do the work. The question that lingers, the question that this story raises but cannot answer, is simple and profound. When the documents that describe reality become more important than reality itself, when the forecasts and the reports and the audited accounts are what everyone relies on rather than what is actually happening, what prevents the next collapse? What ensures that the gap between representation and truth doesn't grow too wide again? The answer is supposed to be oversight. Governance, regulation, professional standards, accountability. These are the mechanisms that theoretically prevent disasters. But Carillion had all of these things. And it collapsed anyway, not because the mechanisms failed in any technical sense, but because the mechanisms were not designed to prevent what actually happened. They were designed to ensure compliance with rules. And the rules allowed a profitable-looking company to be constructed on a foundation of optimistic assumptions about contracts that would not deliver what was promised. So the real lesson of Carillion is not about fraud or corruption or criminal behavior. It's about something more subtle and more systemic. It's about the gap between form and substance, between procedural compliance and actual safety, between looking sound and being sound. And that gap exists everywhere in modern institutions, in every balance sheet, in every audit opinion, in every assurance report. The gap is managed, monitored, minimized where possible. But it cannot be eliminated, and we live with that. We have to. Because the alternative is to distrust every institution and every financial statement and every audited account. To assume everything is fraudulent until proven otherwise. And that would make modern economic life impossible. So we choose to trust. We choose to believe that the auditors did their work and the directors were competent and the numbers approximately reflect reality. We choose this not because we're naive, but because functioning requires it. Carillion tested that trust, broke it, forced a reckoning with how much the system relies on representations that may or may not correspond to underlying truth. The response was to strengthen the representations, to make the oversight more rigorous, to add more checks and more processes and more documentation, which is reasonable, professional, the appropriate institutional response, but it doesn't answer the deeper question. The question about whether a system built on long-term forecasts and complex accounting and mutual dependencies can ever be truly safe. Whether the next Carillion is already forming somewhere, growing quietly, reporting profits that are partially hypothetical, making itself indispensable, preparing, without knowing it, to fail. The corridors are quiet now. The immediate crisis is over. The emergency is managed. Life continues. And in that continuation, in the return to normal, there is both comfort and danger. Comfort because the system proved resilient enough to absorb a major contractor's collapse. Danger because the lessons fade and the vigilance weakens and the next risk grows in the shadows. This is how it works. This is how it has always worked. Institutions fail. Lessons are learned. Reforms are made. Vigilance increases. Then, gradually, imperceptibly, vigilance fades. Lessons are forgotten. Risks accumulate. And one day, in some corridor somewhere, another briefing document will be circulated with red annotations marking a new crisis. The names will be different. The details will vary. But the essential pattern will be familiar. The invisible organ will fail again, and everyone will ask the same questions. Who knew? When did they know? What did they do? And why wasn't it enough? The answers will be familiar too.